have to pardon me, my computer's a bit slow and I'm working through a VPN because I'm based in China. So just give me a minute. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay.
Yeah, we're fine. We're good here.
Great, great. Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present here. I appreciate it. And I've already found several of the presentations to be very stimulating, and also touching on a lot of the concerns that I'm going to be dealing with in my forthcoming thesis, Marxism contra subjectivity, which I didn't maybe fully realize when I wrote it was so much part of a groundswell of interest in these topics in terms of, real abstraction and accelerationism, speculative realism, and so forth. So it's been very interesting for sure. So this presentation is called The Closed Circle of Capitalist Reason, a critique of Brassier qua Brandom. And in it, I'm going to deal with, the sort of use of Brandom by Brassier and the strengths and potential weaknesses of that project. So this critique, the critique in this presentation is from an essay, Speculative Realism and its Successors, which I think, drawing some inspiration from Alberto Toscano, argues that speculative realism, while necessary abstract negation of the post-structuralist consensus, was inadequate insofar as it failed to grasp the relation between correlationism and capitalism, and particularly the link between epistemological dualism and the economic dualism imposed by the commodity form, as in the theory of real abstraction. In the second half of the essay, the quote Prometheanism, often attributed to thinkers such as Ray Brassier and Negarestani, is assessed, focusing particularly on the former's Brandom-influenced 2016 essay, Dialectics Between Suspicion and Trust. That essay was originally written for the forthcoming collection, 15 Years of Speculative Realism, edited by Charlie Johns and Hegelian Ben-Susan. I think Hegelian is actually presenting at this conference. And was paired with a thematically related interview with Toscano, which the interview is called Marxism and Ontology. However, the essay was cut by the publisher Zero Books and will thus appear instead on another forthcoming collection after Speculative Realism from the same editors coming out with Bloomsbury. So you'll have to check out that if you're interested in the essay that I'll be describing here. One second. Sorry, just one sec. It's not. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. Now, it's likely known to anyone attending this conference that just a few years after its formation in 2007, what had been widely billed as the speculative realist movement collapsed into a certain kind of infighting. This dissension was fully apparent by 2011, when Ray Brassier, in an interview with Marcin Richter, scornfully and memorably described the, quote, movement as an orgy of online stupidity, marked by, quote, actor network theory spiced with pan-psychist metaphysics and morsels of process philosophy. Yeah, well, for those who are not familiar with the quote, yeah, quite loaded. Situated in the context of this interview and within his work more generally, clearly the issue here was the charge of epistemological imprudence, the way that thinkers such as Graham Harman and Levi Bryan had parlayed the challenge, the idea that one can only know the correlative thought and being into a justification for threadbare ontologizing. It would be possible to read Brassier's work since then as an attempt to generate a corrective to this tendency, dialecticizing the seller's influence binary between the manifest and scientific image he puts forth in 2007's Nihil Unbound. In this period of his career, his work has often been characterized as Promethean, rationalist, or even accelerationist, and lumped together with texts such as 2013's The Accelerate Manifesto by Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, as well as 2014's The Labor of the Inhuman by Reza Negarestani. These texts putatively share in common a desire to uphold an Enlightenment ideal of reason, even as this may force us to drastically revise our conception of what it means to be human, or abandon activistic commitments premised on a technophobic privileging of direct human interaction. Just one second, I'm just going to remove the, because I put on captions, but just give me a minute. Okay. There we go. Okay. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on Brassier's 2016 essay, Dialectics Between Suspicion and Trust, which heavily channels Robert Brandom's 2012 Reason, Genealogy, and the Hermeneutics of Magnanimity. Brassier begins the essay by referencing Paul Ricoeur's description of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the masters of suspicion, due to the way that they try to identify the salient causal factors that operate behind the back of consciousness, class struggle, the unconscious, and the will to power, respectively. It's a suspicious impulse which demarcates philosophy and theory, whereas the latter, in Frederick Jameson's description, is characterized by an awareness of the constitutive incompleteness of every philosophic system. If Jameson attributes dialectic to theory rather than philosophy, this is because, whereas Kant's historically decisive sundering of rational justification and causal explanation results in the identification of reason with freedom, dialectics insists upon the interruption of the autonomy of the conceptual, but also the non-conceptual conditioning of the conceptual, that is, practice, we could say. With all that said, when it comes to exposing causal blockages, we must be careful to differentiate between the Marxist and Freudian local genealogical method and the Nietzschean global genealogical one. Whereas the former is used to, quote, expose reason's illusory self-sufficiency, the latter wholly reduces reasons to causes, a move that has the perverse consequence of reinstating the pre-Kantian conflation of the two. In this respect, global genealogy runs afoul of Robert Brandom's point that the application of a concept is indissociable from its practical institution, embracing a semantic naivety according to which semantics are capable of functioning independently of pragmatics. Recapitulated negatively as semantic nihilism, this approach contains a clear inconsistency. It draws on semantic resources to describe the beliefs whose contents the description is supposed to render redundant, right? So in a very simple sense, right? Like why, do philosophy at all, right? Philosophy is just a reflection of the will to power, construed ontologically. Identifying the confidence of philosophy and the suspicion of theory as two sides of the same coin, that is, of a Hegelian reason that, quote, takes time, Brassier concludes the essay with a political prescription, that if revolution should come, it should not try to overturn, quote, established norms and hierarchies in the name of, quote, some transcendent superdiscursive absolute. Rather, it should commit itself to diagnosing, I quote, the unconscious blockages, whether social or sexual, that impede the extraction of reasons from causes. And clearly here, it would be Marx on the social and Freud on the sexual. Now, whatever the merits of Brassier's argument here, his reliance on Brandom, I think, poses certain difficulties for it. Brandom's acknowledgement that semantic notions must be understood in relation to inferential processes of social determination represents, it is true, a dialectical advance from the representationalist tradition that has hitherto dominated analytic thought. The problem is that for Brandom, the ability of our semantic resources to access mind-independent reality is simply presupposed. That is to say, there does not exist in his work any means of truly distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate norms. There is a pragmatically instantiated game of giving and asking for reasons, in which practitioners hold each other account for their commitments, which Brandom likens this to a courtroom procedural. Each of us are like judges who, in engaging with the defense attorney, must consult past precedents and decide whether the commitments of previous judges were the correct ones. We do this because we are committed to, quote, how things really are, objectively, in themselves, as being what one takes to be not just an appearance of that reality, but a veridical appearance, one in which things appear as they really are. Yet what is interesting is how little this description has to do with the actual role of judges, who differ from philosophers in that their concern is generally not with how things really are, it is with ensuring that the law is followed. Indeed, even when they overturn precedents, they are still typically beholden to a constitution that the new precedent must issue from, so that if the constitution is irreparably broken, so too will be the objectivity claims arrived at by the judge. What does this tell us about Brandom? First, I think it's just a problem with his reading of Hegel. Hegel does not, as Jonathan Lewis observes, treat reciprocal recognition as a given. Rather, in his work, the capacity of our norms to function legitimately is instead conditional upon the domain of ethics, or ethical life. If a state does not exist which is capable of facilitating mutual recognition, then the norms that arise therefrom will be at least partially illegitimate. And where Brandom addresses this theme, he doesn't really allow it to puncture his Fichtean view of default recognitive relation, instead associating it with a state of hyperobjectivity in which normative statuses are treated as paramount. Second, it suggests a problem with the way that Brandom relates justification to causation. For Brandom, the primary way we arrive at justified beliefs is through drawing inferences. He permits that there are exceptions to this rule, that non-inferential beliefs can be justified if they emanate from, quote, reliable processes. But because Brandom, as a rule, will not license these processes to draw representationalist conclusions, he is forced to simply beg the question. We believe in non-inferential processes because they're reliable, and they're reliable because we believe in them. This is apparent in making it explicit. Brandom supplies the example of Monique working in a kind of scientific botanical context. While Monique claims she cannot, quote, discriminate hornbeams by their leaves, her own view of this competency doesn't matter. What matters is that she's seen as reliable by a community of reasoners. So, of course, even if she lacks confidence in herself, the assessments of her peers here are going to be decisive. But at the level of causality, this proves nothing at all. One could just as easily have argued on these grounds that the Earth is at the center of the solar system, because it has an external referent. The motion of the Earth in orbit is so close to a straight line at a constant speed that it's natural to assume celestial objects are orbiting around us, and was supported by a community of reasoners in the form of ecclesiastical authorities. Of course, on some level, this is why he refuses to eliminate altogether the importance of causal investigation. But when Brandom compares causal explanation to, quote, what the judge had for breakfast, the result is a marginalization of scientific processes, which depend upon the formation of causal hypotheses in favor of a highly philosophical privilege of internal justification. While Brandom himself does not issue Marx, and there now exists a clutch of Brandomian Marxes, we should note how this method diverges from Marx. By stressing the social character of recognitive relations, Hegel left behind a recipe for reason's involution. Marx took advantage of this, producing a historical materialism that does not exist simply to lubricate recognition between reasoners. Rather, what he reveals is the primacy of the forces and relations of production. On this account, the Hegelian narrative of a self-revolutionizing reason would be seen as an ideological effect of a self-revolutionizing capitalism. And this is sort of like the cunning of reason, right? This, idea that things are, progressively, reason's working itself out, it's going to get better, right? What Brandom unironically calls the production and consumption of reasons, and I like that, the production and consumption of reasons, quite apt, is in this context analogous to the myth of an equitous transhistorical simple commodity production. Individuals exchange reasons, reason lurches through history with none too many causal hangups. We're good, right? In actuality, though, and as with capitalism itself, reason does not self-perfect, but absent drastic causal reconfiguration, leads to the annexation of discursive logic by the few. So in the same way that, this process of simple commodity production, which, is a kind of myth, in fact, or self-image of capitalism, in the same way that capitalism leads to a situation, in which there is capital owned, right, by a sort of small clutch of capitalists, in which labor power is broadly exploited as a commodity rather than an environment, right, like simple commodity production, in which we're sort of producing our own goods and sharing them and everything's good, or selling them and everything's good. You could say the same of reason in history, right? That you can't presuppose a kind of default recognitive state, because without a sufficient addressal of the causal aspect, what you're going to get is a kind of discursive or intellectual culture, in which the perspective of a kind of dominant class will be completely regnant in that sense. Brandom's call for exposing causal blockages, but not assigning them primary importance, resembles calls to keep capitalism alive, but to redistribute wealth. Intellectually, he is unwilling to more fully pursue the causal revolution Marx initiates. All this really amounts, as Brassier seems to acknowledge, to a transcendentalization of bourgeois property relations. But in spite of this, Brassier will not disavow it. To do so, he argues, would be to slip into a position according to which the, quote, irrationality of the cause vitiates the rationality of the reason. This all-or-nothing approach to Brandom's work ignores a more subtle solution. That while reasons and causes both have validity, primacy needs to be assigned to the latter within a system capable of identifying their functional role. Even on a scientific level, this holds true. The fact Greek mathematics is likely connected to the spread of commodity exchange in antiquity does not change the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, but the ontological status of numbers very much does within, e.g., quantum mechanics, right? With these premises, Brassier reaches a surprisingly conservative political conclusion. The revolution should not recklessly overturn, quote, norms and hierarchies, but should instead seek to consummate justificatory reason by diagnosing its, quote, blockages. But the metaphysics of property are not something to be fulfilled. They should be broken with. And a revolution that cannot ruthlessly overturn, quote, norms and hierarchies is not worthy of the name. The same focus on continuity over rupture can be found within the other texts Brassier's work has been associated with. In Labor of the Inhuman, Reza Negarestani invades against both a, quote, conservative humanism that overdetermines humanity, as well as a, quote, anti-humanism that subordinates the autonomy of reason, thereby putting, quote, an end to the project of revision. Emblematic of this anti-humanism for Negarestani is, quote, kitsch Marxism, a doctrine that substitutes the updating of its commitments with a, quote, prepackaged ontological given. As with Brandom, albeit to an even greater degree, what is striking about Negarestani's critique of Marxism is the degree to which it is not even a critique. Because Negarestani takes causal reasoning to be ipso facto associable with the natural world, in Brandomian terms, the domain of sentience, any attempt to circumscribe the causal structure of social reality is construed by him as a relapse into theology. The result is a project that, with its fixation on the individual qua game of giving and asking for reasons, is never able to convincingly distinguish itself from the conservative humanism it decries. Quote, if there ever was a real crisis, Negarestani writes, it would be our inability to cope with the consequences of committing to the real content of humanity. This, quote, real content is where Negarestani lodges his own metaphysics. As he puts it, quote, the self-actualizing propensity of reason, a scenario wherein reason liberates its own spaces, despite what naturally appears to be necessary or happens to be the case. So again, we see this, what Marx, I think, would be able to see as a sort of abstraction from or reification of, the self-revolutionizing trajectory of capital, right? This idea of the self-revolutionizing trajectory of reason is taken up by Negarestani in a way that privileges that kind of cognitive process above and beyond the sorts of material analysis that would be characteristic of Marxism. The link with accelerationism is a little bit subtler, but it still very much exists. As with Brassier qua Brandom, Cernacek, Williams, and their ilk take the dialectical telos of capital far too literally, in a way that chafes against Althusser's point, which appeals heavily to Marx's political writings and Lenin. The revolution takes place not where contradiction is simplified, but where there exists an accumulation of them, right? So we have a very, very traditional contradiction here, which is established between the development of forces of production and relations of production. And, part of Althusser's point when he discusses the actual history of capitalism is that, where in a certain sense, the telos that you would extract from a work such as Capital is the idea that revolution is sure to break out in the most developed parts of the world. A more subtle perspective is provided in Marx's political writings, but also that if we look at the 20th century, the tendency for revolution to break out, it didn't occur in places where contradiction was most simplified between labor and capital, like the most developed countries. It was places like, for instance, pre-revolutionary Russia, where you had this whole diffusion and vast array of different contradictions, right? The result is a downplaying of revolutionary agency, of the need for rupture, in favor of a narrow focus on the productive forces, what Allier and Lazzarato have referred to as productivism with a techno beat. One is tempted ultimately to see the projects of Brassier and Negarestani and the left accelerationists as symptomatic of the political climate in the 2010s, in which there remained hope that a left populism could cut through the morass of capitalist reaction without profound destabilization, in which Hegelianism was, not coincidentally, regnant. Perhaps understanding the link between semantics and pragmatics today requires us to grasp that the failure of this political movement is, at the same time, and whatever merit they may have, the failure of these ideas. And I'll just add a couple of notes. It should be noted that the contrast in this presentation between Hegel and Brandom's views of recognitive relation is derived from Jonathan Lewis' 2018 paper, Hegel and the Ethics of Brandom's Metaphysics. And the analysis of Monique and the marginalization of causal analysis within Brandom more generally comes from Ryan Simonelli's 2014 Common Ground and Discursive Justification, approaching the traditional epistemological questions from an unconventional angle. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have about 25 minutes remaining in this session for questions aimed at Conrad, and then, as per Edward's suggestion, if you give an announcement also? Oh, yes, of course. Here we go. Thank you. Okay, great. So, question for Conrad.
Hey, Conrad, JP.
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah. First, yeah, thanks for the paper. I think it's very interesting, but at the same time, I feel that if Ray was here, he would be in agreement with your paper. It's because I don't think he has the same position that he held in 2016, and this was clear yesterday. This is the kind of the first observation. Second one was regarding what you say about the labor of the inhuman. I think we discussed this already, but anyway. Yeah, of course, Reza likes to be polemical. So the teach Marxism bit of the text is always kind of a fulcrum of this kind of discussion. But I think nevertheless that bit about anti-humanism versus conservative humanism points towards something that, interestingly here, I mean, yesterday I was kind of being the advocate for the causes instead of the reasons in my presentation. But now I'll be the advocate for the opposite, because in order to kind of recognize causes and have like a descriptive framework of, like, for instance, causal determination, you must have reason and the workings of revisionary reason as well. So it seems to me that what Reza wants there is kind of criticize not Marxism per se, but a certain sector. Maybe the denomination Marxist is a bit misleading, but I understand a certain form of leftism that is the target there of his notion of kitsch Marxism, that actually is basically applying certain predicates. It's not really describing anything, and not from the standpoint of reasons, and not from the standpoint of causes either. Like, it's just like the sheer application of predicates in a certain sense. So I do think, with all these provisos, I do think that has still kind of a certain importance, and the argument of the essay. I mean, yeah, I think it effectively defends the necessity for the revisionary vector of reason as well. Yes, this is more a comment, maybe a disagreement with one little part of your essay. Anyway, I'm not sure what you have to add about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that if we take it up in a kind of generous as well as general standpoint, then I would agree with you, because of course, our analysis of, even if we have a methodology that's capable of exposing causal mechanisms like Marxism, of course, those can become congealed, right? And there equally has to be an intervention of reason in order to help engage in a process of revision. So that's noted. But I think the real issue would be here that, of course, in those two pieces, I believe Negristani discusses Brandom. So I think the real question would be, well, what kind of mechanisms or what kind of system do we have to actually identify causes? And I really see the weakness of Brandom's work in this respect as being the reliabism, right, that he resorts to, for fear of, making a kind of pure ontological supposition right, or unmediated ontological supposition about the character of reality. And this actually gets to what Edward was saying earlier when he was talking about, the potentially right-wing connotations associated with this emphasis on continuity over rupture, right, in this kind of work. So again, I don't think that it's that he would be wrong in the sense that you're describing it. But I think that if we were to be sort of ruthless, right, and to look at the different sources he's invoking and all of that, we could nevertheless find deficiencies. Now, in a more general sense, I do think there are resources we can use that can help us think critically about causality in this respect. So I think that, for example, if we look at someone like Roy Bhaskar, right, or if we look at critical realism, right, if we look at the difference he establishes between like mechanisms and events and experiences, one very salient feature of his work is that he takes very seriously the idea that there can exist a validity to the social sciences, right? In the way that they're talking about causal mechanisms that may not be immediately visible. And certainly, even in the natural sciences, we find plenty of instances of this, right? So again, I don't think that the issue here would be, you'll notice that in the paper, I don't, completely dismiss the importance of, reasons, right? Or say that, it's just always causes, right? Because that would be, I think, untenable. And I think that Negarestani is certainly correct to that extent. But I think the question is, what kind of structure are we applying to this? And for me, again, like, of course, we can say, well, okay, there's a difference between conservative humanism that, has a very, narrow and circumscribed notion of what the human can be, and a kind of a kind of system or program of revision, right, that embraces the potentially radical implications associated with this kind of revision. But at the same time, there is an issue there, which is that I think we have an overemphasis on, the process of reason itself as being the kind of motor that drives history, precisely at the expense of, the greater focus on causes and material relations that we find in Marx. So that's what I would say to that.
Hello. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. This is a question slightly beyond the scope of what you were talking about, but you're sort of leading there with, some kind of like a bit of accelerationism in that Lazzarato at the end. Just wondering about kind of capitalism in its in its current articulation through kind of post-Fordism, where the spaces, the actual discursive spaces of passing judgment become the site of value production. So, capitalism is the valorization of discursive logic rather than just annexation in a way. And I was kind of wondering whether this is one of those kind of cases that you sort of alluded to at the end, where, the kind of overdetermined contradictions of capital could be exploited, where but both the kind of like, the sort of like ethical basis of resistance where we think revolution are actually the sites of our exploitation. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, totally. Well, yeah. So, I mean, I guess the most radical, maybe the most radical approach to, what you're describing is something like what we find in Negri, right? So in Empire, where he kind of says like, there's no labor theory of value anymore because everything is being valorized all the time, right? And I find that to be, a little bit too broad of a brush, right? Because, on a very even empirical level, we could say like, well, why are there these, fights in France or wherever, right? To continually to elongate the length of the workday, right? If, value production functions in such an undifferentiated way. But nevertheless, it reflects something very real, right? And I think that, Cernicek, who I mentioned himself, has been conscious of this with respect to data economies, which is that we can see that more and more, whereas in Marx, we find this tendency to polarize between, the working day and free time. More and more in our society, we can see that, free time actually becomes structured and arranged in such a way so as to facilitate the valorization of capital, right? And the same can be said of different kinds of activistic commitments. So I think that famously when Mark Fisher, who would be significant for any discussion of the development of left accelerationism, I think at one point, of course, because he has this historical vocation as a music critic, I think at one point he was talking about the suicide of Kurt Cobain, and he was kind of attributing it because he always draws these parallels between mental health and capitalism. But he was attributing it to what I guess Marxists would term real subsumption, right? So the idea that you realize that, even though you have this sort of performative opposition to the status quo, that, certainly by the time it acquires any kind of visibility, it's already been comprehensively recuperated by the capitalist system itself, right? And just become another posture that can be manipulated for the purposes of marketing. So yeah, and I think this gets back to what I was saying, that, if we're going to really, and it's not fully developed, maybe it's a little bit, impressionistic or suggestive in the paper that I gave. But what I basically alluded to, and I was thinking here, of course, a little bit about Bourdieu as well, when he talks about economic capital and cultural capital, which I think is instructive, the need to identify the two. But the idea that, in the same way that this sort of mythic prehistory of capitalism we're supplied with, in which individuals self-produce and exchange the goods they produce, in the same way that this is inadequate for capturing, the character of a commercial environment in which, there are large-scale capitalists who exploit commodified labor power, that I think that, again, the idea of a kind of default recognitive relation doesn't capture the extreme prejudices and fissures that define, our sort of global intellectual discourse, right? So, and like, even to give, this is probably, maybe this is a bit perfunctory or whatever, but even to give a very simple one, we could talk about the ubiquity of the English language, right, with respect to intellectual discourses as being a form of this, right? I mean, this is clearly linked to, the history of colonialism, right? It's linked to, the ongoing status of the United States as the world's foremost superpower, but it imposes great barriers for people who don't speak English as a native language, and particularly for those who aren't being educated at a young age into that kind of linguistic discourse. So that's just one very basic example, but we could give lots of them. And so I think that, again, without a sufficient focus on the causal, what we're going to see is not, simply the admittance of, fissures and prejudices within, kind of the domain of giving and asking for reasons, but also, as you draw attention to itself, the explicit manipulation of it for the purposes of capital accumulation.
Hi, Conrad, Ed here. Thanks so much for the talk. I found that very interesting. I really like the historical overview, kind of knitting that all together. I guess my question is a bit about cause, the concept of cause. And I mean, you were kind of alluding to this. I'm not so familiar with it, the tradition of kind of left accelerationism, and certainly kind of the Nihil Unbound era of Brassier, certainly the kind of and I think there's some kind of alliance or like allegiance there with the French philosophical concept of the real, which is certainly posed as not unrelated to the cause, certainly in kind of French psychoanalytic discourses post-Lacan. And the unsymbolizability of the real as the bone in the throat of the absolute, and I guess like the cause then in that sense, and I think they are different concepts, to the cause as discussed in a kind of natural notion of a kind of naturalism of causes, but the cause functions as the eruption of, and it has an allegiance to that, or there's some kind of like homophony there with the characterization of the real, and as far as I understand it, kind of this early tradition that you were talking about. But yeah, and then my question is kind of, what's then now we're using the same word, Brassier is using the same word now, cause, right? But it doesn't function the same way at all. There's a complete, there is a radical difference of, like the conception of the real in a kind of naturalistic account is much more consistent, regular in a sense, and transitive. Like even if really the notion of the purchase on that is very difficult to talk about. There's still a notion of like the regularity, the normality of the real that I see as absent both in this French tradition that certainly informs Badiou's concept of the event and the real, something like the event as cause, maybe in this French sense. And I'll stop speaking now.
Yeah, well, maybe it would be a case of, because I think that, so obviously like this, the basis of this paper is not, the Brassier of Nihil and Baum, though I do discuss that briefly, because I think if you look at Brassier's engagement with Brandom, again, it's really an attempt to, sort of put this distinction between the manifest and scientific image on wheels, right, in such a way that it doesn't function in this kind of bad infinity. But maybe in a way, the issue, is of, the poles that are broached here and their shared inadequacy with respect to the subject. So if we look at, manifest image, scientific image, one thing that I think sort of
Yeah,
maybe you could put it in the chat.
oh, yeah. Let me, yeah.